let's talk about stromatolites. This is a bunch of different stromatolites, and contrary to how they kind of look, they are not just weird rocks. These are actually biological formations. Stromatolites are formed by layers and layers and layers of sand and silt and other sediment built up, being caught in the adhesive produced by certain microorganisms, largely cyanobacteria. These guys are the cyanobacteria. They are a type of photosynthetic bacteria and may have been the very first true life and living organisms on Earth, and are also most likely the most successful living organism in all of Earth's history. These guys ruled the pretty much entirety of Earth all the way back when Earth first formed and life first started out. They are colonial little photosynthetic bacteria, and they were pretty much the only organisms to exist on Earth for millions, if not billions of years, and even after that, are still some of the most successful organisms today. Most stromatolites found today are actually fossils of incredibly ancient stromatolites produced by those incredibly ancient cyanobacteria. These bacteria produce a very sticky adhesive, and with that adhesive, things like sand and small rocks get caught, and then there's more bacteria, and then there's more sand, and it builds up and up and up until we have these layered stromatolites. Since cyanobacteria reigned supreme for a ridiculous amount of time, there's quite a lot of fossil stromatolites because there were just so many back then. For a while, they were pretty much the only organisms ever. They were also the very first ever photosynthetic organisms, the first ones to actually use sunlight in order to make their own energy. And ironically enough, they were also the cause of the very first mass extinction, that being their own, because photosynthesis produces oxygen as a waste product, and oxygen is actually incredibly toxic. After these guys started to do photosynthesis, they released a ton of oxygen into the atmosphere, and they didn't actually have the means to process the now newly toxic oxygenated atmosphere. There were also no other organisms that utilized oxygen, like plants and animals and other bacteria that used oxygen, so it really had nowhere to go. And it actually poisoned the majority of cyanobacteria that could not process the oxygen. So by harnessing photosynthesis in order to make their own energy, they inadvertently wiped out most life on Earth, including a lot of themselves. But obviously they did not wipe out all life on Earth, as evidenced by the fact that everything else exists right now, and they didn't even wipe out all of themselves, because cyanobacteria in many different species and forms is still very abundant today, and even stromatolites, while not nearly as common as they were way the fuck back then, right at the beginning of Earth, there are still some found today. They're formed by the exact same processes as the ancient ones, with layer of sediment built up on layer of cyanobacteria, repeating. Modern living stromatolites are found in both fresh and marine areas, however, again, much less commonly. They're found in a few places such as Brazil, the Bahamas, a couple lakes in Canada, and the Yucatan Peninsula, among a few select other places. Now, I did say that these guys are alive, and that's technically mostly true. The stromatolite big complex itself is not alive. What we see visually, that is largely the sediment. However, the microorganisms that are secreting the adhesive that binds all of the layers of sediment together, those are largely overall still living cyanobacteria. So these guys do contain living cells. Now, since these guys are so uncommon in modern times, most of the areas that they occur in are protected in things like heritage sites or national parks. And while tourism may be allowed in some of these areas, you are not allowed to touch or otherwise damage these current stromatolites. And it's definitely a good thing that these sites are protected, because these guys show us pretty much exactly how the very first organisms on Earth looked and behaved.